In the first episode of the Texas Revolution, we discussed that by the fall of 1835, tension between Texas settlers and Santa Anna's centralist government had reached the breaking point. When 18 men at Gonzales refused to surrender their cannon to Mexican troops, they fired the first shots of revolution and won. That impossible victory sparked a wildfire of rebellion across Texas, drawing hundreds of volunteers to form the Army of the People. Now they marched towards San Antonio, where fog, fire, and the deadly accuracy of frontier rifles would prove that Gonzales was no accident. The Army of the People that marched west from Gonzales in October 1835 was unlike any military force the world had seen. There were no uniforms. Men wore their everyday clothes, homespun cotton shirts and worn leather breeches. There was no supply train. Each man carried his own provisions or went hungry. There was no formal discipline. Officers were elected by vote, and orders were more like suggestions that could be debated around the campfire. Stephen F. Austin, their newly elected commander, was a diplomat and impresario, not a general. He had never led troops in battle, never studied military tactics, and his health was failing from months of imprisonment in Mexico City. But he understood politics, and he understood that this ragtag force needed a political objective as much as a military one. That objective was San Antonio de Bexar. The old Spanish colonial town sat in the heart of South Texas, a collection of adobe buildings and stone churches clustered around plazas where Mexican soldiers now stood guard. General Martín Perfecto de Cos had arrived with reinforcements, fortifying both the town and the old Mission San Antonio de Valero, a crumbling complex of stone buildings and courtyards that the locals called the Alamo, after the cottonwood trees that grew nearby. If the Texians could take Bexar, they would control all of Texas. The Mexican army would be expelled. The revolution would be won, or so they believed. But first, they had to get there. As the Army of the People moved west, a remarkable figure rode ahead with a company of mounted scouts. Ben Milam, a weathered impresario who had spent time in Mexican prisons for his political views, formed a cavalry screen to scout the route and screen the army's advance. His riders ranged far ahead, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Mexican forces. By mid-October, the army had reached Salado Creek, just east of San Antonio. Here, their numbers swelled to over 400 men as more volunteers arrived, including two groups that would change the character of the army entirely. James Bowie rode in at the head of a company of volunteers. Bowie was already a legend on the frontier, a brawler, a land speculator, a man who carried a knife of his own design that could split a man open from belly to backbone. He had lived in Texas for years, married into a prominent Tejano family, and knew the land and its people better than most Anglos. When Bowie spoke, men listened. With him came Juan Seguin, leading a company of Tejano volunteers, Mexican citizens of Texas who believed in the Constitution of 1824 and were willing to fight their own government to defend it. These men were proof that the Texas Revolution wasn't simply Anglo against Mexican. It was Federalist against Centralist, Constitutionalist against dictator. They wore the same clothes as the Anglo volunteers, carried the same rifles, and shared the same determination. The revolution was becoming something more complex than a simple rebellion. On October 27th, as the army camped near San Antonio, Austin made a decision that nearly proved disastrous. He ordered James Bowie and James Fannin to take 90 men on a scouting mission to find a suitable location for the army to camp closer to the city. They were to survey the old missions south of Bexar and return immediately with their report. Bowie had other ideas. That afternoon, Bowie and Fannin's detachment reached Mission Nuestra Señora de la Purísima Concepción de Acuña, a beautiful stone church with thick walls and a commanding view of the surrounding prairie. But what caught Bowie's tactical eye wasn't the mission itself, it was the river. The San Antonio River curved in a horseshoe bend just below the mission, its banks cutting sharply down to create a natural trench. The riverbed was lower than the surrounding prairie by 6 to 8 feet, with thick vegetation along its edges. It was a natural fortification, a ready-made defensive position that would protect men from artillery fire while allowing them to shoot over the lip of the bank at attackers crossing the open ground above. Despite Austin's orders to return, Bowie decided to camp there for the night. It was a gamble. If the Mexican army discovered them, they would be isolated and outnumbered. But Bowie trusted his instincts and his men. He was about to be proven spectacularly right. October 28th dawned gray and ghostly again. For the second time in the young revolution, dense fog would play a crucial role in battle. The thick mist rolled in from the river bottom, blanketing the prairie in a white shroud that reduced visibility to almost nothing. Inside the Mexican garrison at Bexar, General Cos received intelligence that a Texian force was isolated at Mission Concepción. It was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. If he could destroy this detachment, he would shatter Texian morale and possibly end the rebellion before it truly began. He dispatched Colonel Domingo de Ugartechea, the same officer who had ordered the cannon retrieved at Gonzales, with 275 infantry and cavalry, supported by 2 artillery pieces. It was more than enough force to crush 90 rebels, or so Cos believed. As the Mexican column marched through the pre-dawn darkness toward Concepción, the soldiers were confident. They were professional troops with artillery support, marching against farmers and frontiersmen. This would be a quick fight. But as they approached the mission in the thick fog, they couldn't see what Bowie had seen: the horseshoe bend in the river, the natural trench, the perfect killing ground. The fog was so thick that the Mexican infantry advanced blindly across the open prairie, their officers shouting orders, trying to maintain formation in the murky white void. They knew the Texians were somewhere ahead, but where exactly? The mist played tricks with sound, making distances impossible to judge. Then, from the river bottom, came the thunder of rifles. The Texians, hidden in their natural trench, could see the silhouettes of Mexican soldiers moving through the fog above them, dark shapes against the gray morning sky. The Mexican soldiers, by contrast, were firing at ghosts, their musket volleys going high over the heads of the entrenched defenders. This was where the difference in weaponry became devastatingly clear. The Mexican soldiers carried Brown Bess muskets, British surplus from the Napoleonic Wars, smoothbore weapons with an effective range of maybe 50 yards, and accuracy so poor that military doctrine called for massed volleys rather than aimed fire. You pointed these weapons in the general direction of the enemy and hoped. The Texians carried Kentucky long rifles, personally owned weapons, lovingly maintained, with rifled barrels that spun the bullet for accuracy. In the hands of frontiersmen who had been shooting since childhood, hunting for their family's food, these rifles could pick off a man at 200 yards or more. Bowie's voice rang out over the gunfire. "Aim for the artillerymen!" The cannons were the real threat. If the Mexican artillery could get into position and start raking the river bottom with grape shot, the Texians' advantage would evaporate. But cannons require crews, men to load, aim, and fire them, men who stood exposed while they worked. The Texian riflemen targeted the artillery crews with methodical precision. One by one, the Mexican soldiers trying to operate the cannons fell, shot through the chest, the head, crumpling to the ground. As soon as one man fell, another would rush forward to take his place, and he too would be shot down. It was calculated, cold-blooded killing, and it was brutally effective. The battle lasted only half an hour, but for the men caught in it, those 30 minutes must have felt like an eternity. The Mexican infantry, brave but unable to see their enemy clearly or close the distance effectively, fired volley after volley into the fog. The musket balls whistled overhead, clipping tree branches, thudding into the riverbank, occasionally finding flesh. But the return fire from the Texians was devastatingly accurate. Colonel Ugartechea tried desperately to rally his men, to press the attack, to bring the cannons to bear. But his artillerymen kept falling. His infantry, advancing in the open against an invisible enemy, were being cut down. The fog that had seemed like an advantage, hiding the size of his force, creating confusion, had become his enemy, preventing him from seeing the natural fortification that was protecting the Texians. Finally, as the fog began to lift and the full tactical situation became clear, Ugartechea made the painful decision to retreat. His men had suffered heavy casualties. Estimates range from 14 to 76 killed and wounded, compared to only 1 Texian killed and none seriously wounded. One of his precious cannons had to be abandoned, its crew decimated, as the Mexican forces withdrew in disorder back to Bexar. The Texians emerged from their river-bottom fortress, whooping and cheering. They had faced professional soldiers supported by artillery and not only survived, but won decisively. They claimed the abandoned cannon as a trophy, turning it around to face the city from which it had come. The victory at Concepción sent a surge of dangerous confidence through the Texian ranks. If the pattern held, Gonzales, now Concepción, it seemed like Mexican forces were no match for Texas rifles and Texas courage. The volunteers began to believe they were invincible. But this confidence masked a brewing problem. The Army of the People settled into a siege of San Antonio, camping in the mission south of the city, waiting for General Cos to surrender or for reinforcements to arrive. Days turned into weeks. The weather grew colder, supplies dwindled. Boredom and hunger began to erode the volunteers' enthusiasm. Men started drifting away, back to their farms and families. Others grumbled about the lack of action, the discomfort, the seeming pointlessness of sitting outside a fortified city without making a real attack. Stephen F. Austin, struggling with his health and his inexperience as a military commander, left to serve as a commissioner to the United States, hoping to secure diplomatic and military support. Edward Burleson was elected as the new commander, but the Army's cohesion was crumbling. By late November, the siege was in danger of collapsing entirely. Then came the grass fight. On November 26th, a cold and dreary late autumn morning, the siege's monotony was shattered by exciting news. Erastus "Deaf" Smith, a scout so valued that his nickname had become a badge of honor, rode into camp with urgent intelligence. A Mexican pack train was approaching San Antonio from the south, Smith reported. 50 to 100 soldiers were escorting a long line of mules loaded with heavy packs. Rumors spread instantly through the camp. The mules were carrying silver bullion, payment for the Mexican garrison. Thousands of pesos, maybe tens of thousands, enough to make every man in the army rich. It was too good to resist. Burleson immediately ordered James Bowie to intercept the pack train with the cavalry. Infantry would follow in support. This wasn't just a military operation. This was a chance for plunder, for the reward that many volunteers felt they deserved for their weeks of discomfort. The Texian cavalry thundered west from camp, kicking up clouds of dust, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. They caught up with the pack train near Alazan Creek, west of the city, and charged. The Mexican escort, caught in the open with slow-moving pack animals, had two choices: stand and die, or run and live. They chose the latter, abandoning the mules and fleeing back toward the safety of Bexar's walls. Some of the Texian horsemen pursued them, rifles barking, while others surrounded the captured mules. This was it, the moment of triumph. The volunteers began ripping open the packs, eager to see the glint of silver. Instead, they found grass. There was no silver, no pesos, no treasure at all, just bundles of freshly cut grass, forage for the starving horses of the Mexican cavalry trapped inside Bexar. The disappointment was crushing. Some men laughed at the absurdity, others cursed. A few wondered if they'd been tricked somehow. But the grass fight, as it immediately became known, revealed something more important than any silver could have. General Cos was desperate. His cavalry horses were literally starving. The siege was working. The Mexican garrison, cut off from supply lines, was being slowly strangled. Cos had been forced to send soldiers outside the city walls just to harvest grass, a desperate move that cost him men and morale. The Texians returned to camp with their bundles of grass, the butt of their own joke. But Bowie and the other experienced officers understood the significance. Cos's cavalry was becoming useless without horses. His infantry was low on supplies. The fortifications might look imposing, but inside those walls, the Mexican army was weakening day by day. The question was, would the Texian army hold together long enough to capitalize on it? By early December, the siege was nearing its breaking point, but not for the Mexicans. The Texian volunteers were ready to quit. Winter was setting in, bringing cold nights and occasional freezes. Food was scarce. There was no pay, no plunder, no glory in sitting around campfires waiting for something to happen. Commander Burleson and most of his officers were ready to lift the siege and retreat to Goliad for the winter. It was the sensible thing to do, the practical choice. They could regroup, resupply, and return in the spring when conditions were better. The army prepared to march away from San Antonio, leaving General Cos and his garrison untouched. But one man refused to accept this decision. One man believed that victory was within their grasp if they would only seize it. One man was about to draw a line, not in sand, but in the dirt of a military camp, and change the course of the revolution. His name was Benjamin Rush Milam, and he was about to ask a question that would echo through Texas history. What would you choose to do? Return to Goliad to regroup and attack in the spring? Or press on in the dead of winter and continue the siege for a possible victory now? Let me know in the comments. The fight has begun and is continuing. Stay tuned as the Texians fight at San Antonio de Bexar and find out whether it was a winter or spring battle, as well as who won. Like and subscribe so you don't miss it. Until next time, stay curious.